Imagine being sprawled on the frigid earth, yet finding no solace in sleep. Indeed, no one in this camp could. Beyond the timber palisades, concealed by darkness, tens of thousands of Germanic warriors observed, anticipated. Their presence was palpable through their unsettling chants, meant for your ears. The soldier beside you bore the trauma of the Teutoburg engagement, a story he never recounted, but whose tremors were evident in his shaking hands whenever the mist descended. 6 years prior, 3 entire Roman legions vanished into a similar forest. 15,000 lives extinguished. The revered Roman eagles, sacred emblems considered the very spirit of a legion, had been torn asunder and impaled on trees like hunting trophies. Now, you stand in that same woodland, shrouded in the same fog, confronting the same adversary. General Caecina Severus, too, remained awake, tormented by a nightmare wherein Verus, the defunct Roman commander responsible for those legions' demise, emerged from a swamp, crimson and reaching for him. He awoke drenched in perspiration. Only hours before, his mount had been killed in combat. Now, a shriek echoes through the camp. Germans have breached the gates. Soldiers seize their armaments and surge forward. Caecina Severus had to hurl himself into the gateway, nearly crushed by his own troops. Take a moment to grasp the gravity. One of Rome's most distinguished generals, boasting 4 decades of military expertise, lying prostrate in the mire to prevent his men from blindly rushing into the dark embrace of death. This is the Battle of Pontes Longi, the Long Bridges, in 15 AD, an incident that nearly mirrored the disaster of Teutoburg and almost eradicated 4 more Roman legions. Most are unaware of its existence, but that changes today. Welcome back. If this is your initial visit, you've chosen a remarkable video. Stay with us to grasp the events of 15 AD. To do so, one must first comprehend the profound impact of events 6 years earlier that Rome was still struggling to process. On September 9th, 9 AD, 3 Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, marched through the Teutoburg forest in what is now northwestern Germany. Their leader, Publius Quintilius Verus, placed absolute faith in his guide, Arminius. Arminius, a Germanic chieftain, was also a Roman citizen, a trained Roman officer, someone who had dined at Roman tables and worn Roman armor. He possessed an intimate understanding of Roman warfare and leveraged every detail to devastate them. Over 3 days of ambushes in constricted forest passages, Arminius and his confederate Germanic tribes decimated all 3 legions. Between 15,000 and 20,000 soldiers perished. Verus committed suicide. Roman captives were sacrificed on forest altars by the Germanic warriors. The 3 eagle standards, the sacred insignia of these legions, were seized and carried deep into the woods. When news reached Emperor Augustus in Rome, historians recount that he did not cut his hair or shave his beard for months. He roamed his palace at night, reportedly striking his head against the walls, crying into the darkness, "Veri, give me back my legions." He never recovered them. Those 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were never re-established, their numbers permanently retired. An indelible scar was etched into Rome's military identity. Tiberius ascended to the emperorship in 14 AD following Augustus's death. Almost immediately, he entrusted one of the most sensitive military missions in Roman history to his nephew, Nero Claudius Germanicus, whom history simply calls Germanicus. Though only about 28 when the campaigns commenced, Germanicus had already garnered immense popularity among the legions, perhaps too much, depending on who you asked. Tiberius had reasons for apprehension regarding his nephew's growing influence, but that is a narrative for another time. The crucial aspect now is the objective: infiltrate Germania, avenge Teutoburg, retrieve the lost eagle standards, and demonstrate that Rome's dishonor would not go unpunished. The sheer scale of Germanicus's assembly was astonishing. By 15 AD, he commanded between 55,000 and 70,000 soldiers operating in Germania, supported by naval detachments along the North Sea and river systems. This was no mere raid. It was Rome exerting its full might, a decisive declaration. The army was divided. Germanicus commanded one force, while his second-in-command, Caecina Severus, led the other 4 legions from the Lower Rhine army. They operated independently for portions of the campaign, then merged, then separated again during the return march. This return march precipitated the crisis. Before the actual combat even began, Germanicus made a decision that set the emotional tone for all subsequent events. He led his entire army, tens of thousands of men, directly to the Teutoburg massacre site, to the precise location where those soldiers had been slaughtered 6 years prior. What they discovered, according to the historian Tacitus, was nearly unbearable. Scattered bones, bleached by the elements, lay across the open fields. Half-buried broken weapons littered the earth, while human skulls were affixed to trees. Forest groves held altars where Roman prisoners had been offered as sacrifices. Among the soldiers on this march were survivors of Teutoburg, men who had witnessed the carnage firsthand. As they traversed the site, they pointed out critical locations. "Here is where the officers fell," they would say. "This is where the eagles were captured." Here, Verus made his final stand. Tacitus records that the entire army undertook the grim task of burying the remains they found. He observed, "I am not a soldier, knowing whether he was interring the relics of a relative or a stranger, but looking on all as kinsfolk of their own blood." Following this, the historian notes, their rage against the enemy rose higher than it had ever been. This intensified fury was soon to play a crucial role. Here's how the 15 AD campaign unfolded on the ground. Germanicus drove deep into the territory of the Cherusci, Arminius's native land. Meanwhile, Caecina advanced from the northwest, ravaging the territories of the Bructeri and the Marsi. Roman forces managed to capture Thusnelda, Arminius's pregnant wife, and dispatched her to Rome. Despite his tactical genius, Arminius couldn't be everywhere at once. The Romans managed to recover one of the 3 lost legionary eagle standards. Just one, but its retrieval was significant. It served as both a symbol and a validation that their mission was not futile. Then, in the late summer, near the Ems River, the 2 Roman armies confronted Arminius and his warriors in an open field. This is where the situation grew complex, as the battle near the Ems proved inconclusive. Arminius skillfully trapped the Roman cavalry and inflicted severe damage. Germanicus responded by moving his legions into a complete battle formation, prompting Arminius to withdraw. Neither side could claim a definitive victory. The challenging terrain made a decisive win virtually impossible for all involved. Consequently, Germanicus made a pivotal decision that shaped subsequent events. The campaign season was drawing to a close, and it was time to retreat to winter quarters along the Rhine. He divided his army into 3 contingents for the journey back. His own 4 legions would embark by ship, sailing down the Ems and along the North Sea coast. A cavalry detachment, led by Paedo Albinovanus, would ride back through Frisian territory along the coastline. Caecina's 4 legions, the 1st Germanica, the 5th Alaudae, the 20th Valeria Victrix, and the 21st Rapax, were to march overland. Their path involved a narrow, elevated causeway spanning miles of marshland and dense forest, situated between the Ems and Rhine rivers. This road had been constructed decades earlier during previous Roman campaigns in the area, and was known to the Romans as the Pontes Longi, or Long Bridges. Germanicus recognized the inherent danger. Before the separation, he explicitly instructed Caecina, "Get through those causeways as fast as you possibly can." Arminius, upon learning of this, was already in motion. The remarkable thing about Arminius, and what truly made him a formidable military strategist, was his intimate knowledge of this road. He likely knew every bottleneck and choke point along its entire length. He understood precisely how a Roman army would fare attempting to traverse such terrain. Slow, burdened, and exposed. He made his plans accordingly. Let's examine the 2 central figures in this narrative, Aulus Caecina Severus. By 15 AD, This individual had been engaged in Rome's conflicts for approximately 4 decades. He had been appointed consul as early as 1 BC by Augustus himself. His campaigns spanned Pannonia, Dalmatia, and Moesia. He was deeply involved in the bloody Great Illyrian Revolt of 6 AD, one of the most brutal Roman campaigns of that era. When Tacitus depicts him, the impression conveyed, to paraphrase, is that Caecina possessed absolute fearlessness, not recklessness. It was a specific kind of fearlessness, born from having survived so many events that would have killed a lesser man, where fear itself loses its grip. One simply sees too much to flinch any longer. He commanded 4 legions. To give a brief overview of these units, the first legion, Legio I Germanica, was the unit that would repeatedly save Caecina's life throughout this campaign. The 5th Alaudi, famously known as the Larks, was one of the most celebrated legions in Roman history, originally raised by Julius Caesar himself in Gaul. The 20th Valeria Victrix had a reputation for an almost obsessive level of discipline. The 21st Rapax, the Predator, was known for its sheer aggression. 4 distinct personalities, 4 different military cultures, all under the command of one general, attempting to keep them cohesive on arguably the most treacherous road in the known world. Each of these legions, at full strength, comprised roughly 5,000 to 6,000 heavy infantry, supplemented by cavalry and auxiliary units. Caecina's total force amounted to approximately 20,000 men, including auxiliaries and logistical support. This was a substantial number of soldiers. However, in the terrain they were about to enter, sheer numbers could be a disadvantage as easily as an advantage. A long column, strung out on a narrow causeway, projects not strength, but vulnerability. Alongside this legion of troops marched their entire logistical support system. The baggage train, various carts, pack animals, vast quantities of food, pay chests, combat gear, and the personal possessions belonging to thousands of soldiers. Within the framework of Roman military doctrine, safeguarding these provisions was nearly as crucial as safeguarding the soldiers themselves. Losing the baggage meant utterly jeopardizing the entire campaign, the supplies, the financial backing, and quite possibly the army's will to continue fighting. This aspect will prove pivotal later on. For those familiar with our earlier content, it's already clear that in ancient warfare, logistics were paramount. If you're new here, now you're informed. Moreover, if you have a penchant for in-depth military history analysis, then this channel is tailor-made for you. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming releases. Now let's turn our attention to his adversary, Arminius. Born around 17 BC as the son of a Cheruscan chieftain, he was dispatched to Rome in his youth. This was part of a custom where Germanic tribal leaders relinquished their sons to Rome as political pawns. In exchange, these sons received a Roman education, Roman citizenship, and Roman military training. It was a strategy employed by Rome to maintain control over the border tribes while cultivating a cadre of amenable, Romanized leaders who could oversee the frontier on Rome's behalf. For most young men in this predicament, the system functioned precisely as intended. They returned thoroughly Romanized, managed their tribes according to Roman principles, and remained loyal. Arminius, however, returned with every advantage Rome had bestowed upon him. His tactical expertise, a profound comprehension of Roman battle formations, their strengths, their vulnerabilities, the characteristic behavior of a Roman column under assault, the psychological significance of the eagle standards, and the methods of communication among Roman officers during skirmishes. He had absorbed and internalized all of this, and then he weaponized it against them. By 15 AD, Arminius, then approximately 33 years old, was the most sought-after individual in the Roman Empire. He had deprived Rome of its entire claimed province east of the Rhine. He had utterly disgraced Augustus. His very existence and unwavering defiance had fueled this entire punitive expedition. Yet, he faced his own set of challenges. His wife, Thusnelda, who was pregnant when captured, was now in Roman custody, being escorted toward Rome. His father-in-law, Segestes, a Cheruscan chief, had consistently favored Rome, and the two men detested each other. Arminius had essentially taken Thusnelda against Segestes' wishes. In fact, Segestes had forewarned Verus about Arminius's conspiracy in 9 AD. Verus had disregarded the warning, but the family feud was genuine, ongoing, and it cost Arminius crucial support he could ill afford to lose. More significantly for our narrative, Arminius led a coalition, not a unified military force. Germanic tribes did not operate with the same organizational structure as Rome. There was no senate, no established chain of command, no centuries of ingrained institutional military discipline. Instead, there were chiefs. Some warriors followed these chiefs out of personal fealty and the promise of glory and spoils. Arminius was preeminent among these chiefs, but merely a primus inter pares, not a supreme commander in the Roman sense. His uncle, Guiamer, was a prominent figure within this alliance. Guiamer had been a Roman associate for years before defecting. His switch of allegiance to Arminius's cause was a significant triumph, bringing substantial fighting power and tribal legitimacy to the Germanic side. And Guiamer held strong convictions regarding battle tactics. These convictions were poised to override Arminius's strategy at the absolute worst possible juncture. But I am getting ahead of the tale. Let's hit the road. It was late summer of 15 AD. The season for military campaigns was drawing to a close. The harvest had been gathered. The rivers were swelling. The days were shortening. Germanicus had tangible achievements to his credit. He had advanced deep into Germanic territory. He had overseen the burial of the fallen at Teutoburg. He had recovered one eagle standard and had inflicted heavy losses on multiple tribes, ensuring they would remember the encounter for generations. Arminius's wife was in irons, bound for Rome. But Arminius himself remained undefeated. The Germanic coalition was battered but unbroken. And Germanicus was astute enough to recognize the folly of wintering 60,000 men in hostile territory on the wrong side of the Rhine. Consequently, he formulated a plan for withdrawal. #! At meta:"P. Sex 1.0. 3 routes, 3 distinct forces, moving more or less simultaneously. Germanicus's own 4 legions would embark on ships at the Ems and sail home, representing the swiftest and safest available option. The cavalry, under Paedo Albinovanus, would proceed along the Frisian coast, and Caecina's 4 legions would travel overland via the Pontes Longi. Germanicus was acutely aware of the perils of the overland route. He stated this explicitly. As recounted by Tacitus, he pointedly cautioned Caecina to traverse those causeways with maximum speed. The directive was unmistakable. Swiftness was his sole defense in that region. Do not halt. Do not grant anyone an opportunity to organize resistance against you. Sound advice indeed. The predicament, however, was that the road itself was barely passable any longer, and Arminius had no intention of affording Caecina the necessary speed. I want you to really visualize the Pontes Longi, as its topography is paramount here. This isn't a conventional road by any stretch, but rather an elevated causeway, a series of wooden platforms and earthen banks spanning miles of marshy, waterlogged lowlands. It was constructed during prior Roman excursions in the area, likely between 7 BC and 1 AD, under the command of Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus during his campaigns north of the Danube and through Cheruscan territory. By 15 AD, it had been neglected in the damp Germanic wilds for over a decade, with no upkeep whatsoever. Wood decays, earth settles, and water inevitably seeps through. When Caecina's advance scouts reached it, the route was in terrible disrepair. Entire segments were impassable for 20,000 soldiers and the heavy supply train. They would have to mend it as they progressed, which necessitated stopping. Precisely the kind of slow, arduous advance Germanicus had explicitly cautioned against. On both sides of the causeway lay a swamp, not a picturesque one, but a Germanic morass, thick, treacherous, and sucking, ranging from ankle to knee-deep depending on where one stepped. This was terrain where Roman armor became a detriment, where coordinated combat was nearly impossible, and where the entire strength of legionary discipline, the shield wall, the synchronized push, and the lethal efficiency of close-order infantry simply vanished. Above the swamp, on either flank, were wooded hills, a sprawling forest. This was ideal for an adversary born in those woods, who had hunted there since childhood. Perfect for men who traveled light, carried long spears and throwing weapons, and could strike and retreat into the trees before a Roman officer could even formulate a coherent response. Arminius hadn't fled after the indecisive skirmish near the M. Instead, he had maneuvered, using paths and shortcuts known only to his people, leveraging an intimate familiarity with the landscape that was literally encoded in his being. He force-marched his warriors to get ahead of Caecina's column. When Caecina arrived at the long bridges, Arminius was already positioned on the hills above him, observing, counting the legions stretched out below, and patiently awaiting the perfect moment. Caecina gazed up at those hills, fully aware of what lay in wait. He ordered his men to commence repairs and establish a fortified camp at the causeway's entrance. What followed was 3 days of absolute torment. The tactical situation was almost elegant in its brutality. Caecina's troops needed to be in 2 places simultaneously, fending off assaults from the hills while undertaking engineering work in the swamp below. He divided them. One group repaired the causeway, the other provided cover. Imagine this scene on the ground. Heavy Roman legionaries in full lorica segmentata, articulated iron plates strapped over a thick linen tunic, struggling to swing hammers and lay logs while submerged knee-deep in mud. Other legionaries formed ranks on any elevated ground they could find, holding their scutum shields against a barrage of javelins and spears raining down from Germanic warriors who held the high ground, were fresh, and attacked entirely on their own terms. Germanic warriors of this era were not chaotic. They were skilled individual fighters operating in coordinated tactical units. They wielded the framia, a long spear equally effective as a throwing or thrusting weapon. They were swift and aggressive, possessing the most potent advantage any fighter can have, the ability to choose when to engage and when to withdraw. They struck and disappeared, struck and disappeared. Caecina couldn't simply charge up those hills. The swamp guarded his flanks, and the instant his men broke formation in that terrain, they would be doomed. The Romans suffered casualties, not catastrophic on day 1, but significant, tangible losses. They barely managed to construct enough of the causeway to advance slightly by nightfall. Exhausted, bleeding, and caked in mud from head to toe, they made camp. Then, in the dark of night, Arminius put his own engineers to work. This detail reveals everything about Arminius as a commander. He didn't merely harass the Romans, hoping for attrition. He had his men dig into the hillsides above the valley, diverting the natural flow of streams so that water cascaded into the lowlands overnight. By morning, every section of the causeway Caecina's men had spent an entire day building had been washed away. Day 2, they had to restart from scratch, once again under fire. Day 2, and this is where matters genuinely spiraled out of control. Caecina deployed his 4 legions in a formation designed for both movement and combat. The 1st Legion took the vanguard, the leading position directly facing the hills, the most exposed point in the entire column. In Roman military doctrine, such placement was considered an honor. When you're facing significant danger, you position your most proficient and trustworthy unit at the vanguard. The 5th Alidi secured the right flank, while the 21st Reax protected the left. Bringing up the rear, the 20th was tasked with preventing any rear attacks. This theoretically presents a robust defensive march formation. However, the terrain effectively nullified its effectiveness. A fully outfitted Roman legionary, laden with armor, a shield, javelins, a sword, and personal gear, carries approximately 80 pounds beyond their own body weight. On firm ground, this weight is manageable. Roman training instilled the endurance and strength required to bear it over extended distances. Yet on waterlogged ground, where each step risks sinking into mud and the footing is constantly unstable, such weight becomes overwhelmingly debilitating, eroding discipline faster than almost anything else. The 5th and 21st, guarding the flanks, were experiencing severe hardship. These flank positions are the most vulnerable in that type of terrain, as one is off the main path at the swamp's edge. Moreover, Germanic warriors on the hills relentlessly directed concentrated fire onto these flanks, hour after hour. After enduring this struggle for the majority of the day, the legions on the flanks made a decision, individually comprehensible but tactically disastrous. They advanced to higher, dry ground. Without orders, they fractured the formation. Consequently, the column's center, the road itself, carrying the wounded, carts, baggage, and support staff, was left entirely exposed on both sides. Concurrently, the baggage train encountered its own crisis. Carts became mired and immobile. Those behind them had no path forward, causing the entire column to back up like a pileup on a highway. The 20th Legion at the rear, observing gaps forming ahead, saw soldiers abandon ranks and surge forward to assist in freeing the stuck carts, thereby leaving the column's rear undefended. For several agonizing minutes, the entire formation of 20,000 men disintegrated in slow motion on a narrow log road traversing a swamp, with Germanic warriors assailing every exposed side from the hills. Tacitus's description of this moment is precise and harrowing. He recounts pandemonium, men yelling over each other, carts obstructing the route, soldiers wandering aimlessly, and officers unable to make themselves heard. Some of the centurions within these legions had survived Teutoburg. They had witnessed this exact type of escalating breakdown destroy 3 legions just 6 years prior. They recognized the pattern of events, and this realization intensified their distress, as the younger soldiers could discern it in the veterans' expressions. Caecina literally lunged into the fray. He dismounted, stood in the path of retreating soldiers, physically obstructed them with threats, and maintained the line through his sheer personal resolve. Amidst the fiercest fighting, his horse was killed beneath him, struck by a spear or arrow from Germanic warriors pressing in close. He fell into the mud. The 1st Legion fought their way to him and extricated him. Consider what his soldiers witnessed at that juncture. Their general, the veteran of 40 years of service, having endured countless challenges, now on the ground and horseless, trapped in a crumbling column on a swamp road in the heart of Germanic territory. In that instant, he made a decision that distinguishes competent generals from truly great ones. He commanded the abandonment of the baggage. Every single item, every cart, every pack animal, all cargo on those wagons. Let it go, he instructed. Do not die for supplies. Get the men to high ground. It proved effective. The 1st and 20th, now unburdened by the baggage crisis, fought their way clear and rejoined the 5th and 21st on solid ground as night fell. 4 legions, barely but still intact. They erected a camp on the elevated terrain. Even an emergency Roman marching camp, constructed in a single evening, constituted a formidable defensive structure. Earthen walls, sharpened stakes, and a standardized internal layout that every Roman soldier knew by rote. Despite their exhaustion and injuries, the legions built their walls. However, walls cannot suppress internal fear. Throughout the night, the Germanic warriors encircled the camp but did not attack. They sang, they chanted, they rattled weapons against shields, allowing the sounds to reverberate through the darkness. This was a well-documented psychological tactic frequently employed by Germanic tribes during this era. The Romans recorded it on multiple occasions, and its objective was straightforward: deprive the enemy of sleep, infuse the night with dread, and let the soldier's own anxieties inflict more damage than any spear. It worked. Caecina, as previously mentioned, experienced that nightmare, Verus, emerging from the swamp, covered in blood, reaching for him. He awoke to the sound of Germanic war cries echoing through the forest. His men were not asleep. Many were pacing between fires, conversing in hushed tones, unable to find rest. The older soldiers were recounting to the newer recruits the sights and sounds of Teutoburg from an insider's perspective. And the younger soldiers, gazing at the weathered faces of their elders, understood this wasn't merely a tale. Then, a shriek pierced the air. Tacitus doesn't specify who or why. Perhaps it was a sentry spotting movement in the gloom. Perhaps it was a nightmare involuntarily voiced. Regardless, within moments, the message swept through the encampment. The Germans are inside the perimeter. They've breached the defenses. Thousands of troops seize their weapons, surging towards the gates. Not to engage, but to flee. Every primal instinct for self-preservation screamed the same command: escape, reach the river, vanish. Caecina Severus reached the main gate first, throwing himself down in the mud, directly in the path of his own soldiers. He declared that if they wished to exit, they would have to trample over their commanding general. That brought them to a halt. As Caecina Severus held his army together by obstructing a thoroughfare, Arminius was convening a war council in the hills overlooking the camp. Pay close heed here, for this discussion, occurring on this singular night, is arguably the pivotal moment of the entire engagement. It illustrates a theme that spans all human history, from ancient tribal gatherings to contemporary boardrooms. What transpires when the most astute individual in the assembly is overruled? The Germanic alliance had the Roman forces precisely where they desired. 4 legions, fatigued, devoid of their supplies and baggage, encircled in unfamiliar territory, operating on minimal sleep and flagging morale. Caecina Severus's troops had endured continuous fighting for 2 full days. Their rations were depleted, the supply train was gone. They were famished, sleep-deprived, and on the brink of another panic at the slightest rumor. The relentless pressure applied by Arminius was proving effective. Arminius rose and presented his strategy. It was clear, patient, and perfectly conceived. His argument was to refrain from assaulting the camp. Roman military installations are inherently designed for defense. The walls, the layout, the way Roman soldiers instantly revert to disciplined formations when given a distinct, structured objective to safeguard. These are undeniable advantages. Attacking a fortified Roman camp from the exterior means confronting them at their absolute zenith of strength. Do not offer them this opportunity. Wait until dawn. Allow them to march forth. Let them return to the causeway, back onto that narrow log road across the swamp, with their flanks exposed and their column extended thinly for miles. That is where we decimated 3 legions 6 years prior. That is where we nearly dismantled these 4 yesterday. Out on the road, in the bog, stretched out and slow. That is where Roman tactical discipline completely disintegrates. That is where we will annihilate them. This wasn't cautious deliberation, it was meticulous planning. Arminius was detailing a second Teutoburg, practically step by step. He informed his chieftains, "We are literally 1 morning away from the greatest Roman military catastrophe since 9 AD. Ingumius, however, disagreed, and critically, his objection did not stem from foolishness. It originated from a fundamentally different set of values. For Germanic warriors, warfare was not solely about strategic outcomes, it was about honor. It was about the spoils you could bring home, about the sagas that would be recounted about you around fires for generations. Arminius's scheme meant allowing the Romans to remain behind their fortifications for another night. More waiting, more forbearance, more reliance on strategy over instinct. But Ingumius could see the Roman camp perched on the hill. He could envision the eagle standards within those walls. He could feel the significance of storming those gates at first light, overwhelming the defenders and emerging with everything. He declared, "We assault the camp at sunrise. We seize it. Glory to the men who scale those walls first." The other chieftains concurred. Arminius was outvoted. Read that again and absorb it. The man who devised and executed the ambush that obliterated 3 Roman legions. The man who had just spent 2 days steadily breaking down Caecina Severus's column. The man who deliberately flooded the valley at night to undo a full day of Roman engineering efforts. That man instructed his war council precisely what to do and exactly how to triumph. and his council voted against him because the alternative felt more gratifying. This is the inherent tragedy of coalition warfare. When centralized authority is absent, Arminius did not command in the manner Caecina Severus did. He could not issue directives and expect obedience regardless of personal agreement. He had to persuade every single time. And that night, his powers of persuasion failed. He accepted the verdict, having no genuine alternative. And he led the assault on the Roman camp at dawn. Before we reach sunrise, let us pause for a moment and truly contemplate what hung in the balance that night. Had Arminius prevailed in that crucial vote, and had the alliance embraced his strategy of permitting the Romans to advance before striking them again on the causeway in broad daylight, what would the outcome have been? Caecina's forces were in dire straits. They lacked provisions and supplies, their gear was gone, and they were physically and mentally spent after 2 continuous days of battle. A renewed Germanic assault on a weary, starving column attempting to traverse that narrow causeway, with no room to maneuver or reinforcements, would have been devastating. The resemblance to Teutoburg is not merely striking, it is almost exact. 4 more Roman legions, the 1st, 5th, 20th, and 21st, would have been annihilated. All gone in a single morning on one narrow path within a section of Germanic swampland. This was no trifling loss. In 15 AD, the Roman Empire maintained roughly 25 to 30 active legions across its vast territories. Losing 4 in one engagement would have meant eradicating approximately 13 to 16% of Rome's entire professional military in a single day. When combined with the 3 legions lost at Teutoburg 6 years prior, that would total 7 legions gone in 6 years, all within one theater of war. Contemplate the ramifications for Tiberius, for Rome standing on every other border, in Syria, North Africa, or along the Danube, and for the soldiers stationed in Gaul, observing the incoming reports. Imagine the impact on Arminius, his reputation, his alliance, and his capacity to maintain the unity of diverse Germanic tribes under his command. A catastrophe of such magnitude would have fundamentally altered the entire equation of Roman involvement east of the Rhine, potentially permanently. History hinged on a tribal council's decision in a somber forest. One individual was correct, yet he lost the debate. And the reasons for his defeat, pride, ambition, and the promise of plunder, nearly reshaped everything. However, events unfolded differently. The reason they did not is evident in the figure standing at a gateway, mud staining his armor, having just calmed 20,000 terrified men from a mass panic. Caecina anticipated the impending assault. He dedicated the remainder of the night to preparing for it. If you've read this far and haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button. This is precisely the kind of content we offer, and there's much more planned. Every Roman soldier learned one crucial lesson from his earliest training. A Roman military camp possessed a standardized internal road system. The Via Principalis and the Via Praetoria crisscrossed its interior, connecting all 4 gates. This layout was uniform throughout the empire, every camp, every time, built to the same specifications. Consequently, every Roman soldier knew the exact location of everything: the armory, the command post, the gates, the defensive positions, even in complete darkness without conscious thought. It was ingrained muscle memory, honed through years of repetition. When Arminius spearheaded the Germanic attack on Caecina's camp at dawn, he was assailing the very type of fortification Rome was structurally best equipped to defend, and Caecina had spent the entire night ensuring his men were ready. The attack converged on the walls, Germanic warriors storming earthen ramparts under a hail of javelins from defenders positioned above them is tactically unsound. But it can succeed through sheer numbers and ferocity if the defenders falter even for a moment. Ingumice led from the front, as was expected of Germanic chieftains. The warriors slammed into the walls. Caecina ordered a sortie, not a holding action, not a defensive countermeasure designed to weather the assault, but a full offensive charge. Multiple gates burst open simultaneously, and legionaries streamed out in tight formations, striking the attackers from various directions while they were still pressed against the walls or attempting to scale them. The surprise was absolute. Germanic warriors in the middle of a fortification assault are entirely committed, both physically and psychologically, to their attack. The absolute last thing one expects when charging a wall is for the wall to suddenly come at you from 3 directions simultaneously. The Romans struck them in the flanks and rear in disciplined, close-order formations, while the Germanic warriors were disorganized, exposed, and utterly caught off guard. Ingumus sustained wounds severe enough to remove him from the remainder of the battle. The assault disintegrated. Germanic warriors scattered back into the forest, not in an orderly retreat, but in a chaotic, genuine rout. Tacitus leaves no ambiguity about the completeness of this reversal. He recounts that the victory was so decisive that Caecina's legions faced no further serious threats for the rest of their march to the Rhine. The core of the Germanic offensive had been shattered in a single morning. And just like that, the entire dynamic shifted. Caecina completed the repairs to the causeway, the task his engineers had desperately worked on for 2.5 full days. The legions formed up and marched onward. The remaining Germanic warriors in the area were in no condition to mount another coordinated attack. They made sporadic attacks on the column's flanks as it moved, yet these were mere disruptions, not actual combat. The immediate threat had passed. Caecina managed to bring all 4 legions back to the Rhine, albeit bruised, considerably reduced in numbers, and without their supply train, but with their fighting capability intact. Upon his return to Rome, he was given triumphal honors, the symbolic triumphalia, the highest military award available to a non-imperial general. He absolutely deserved it. Let's really examine the true cost of Pontes Longi. Precise Roman casualty figures are not available. Historical writers of that era were famously imprecise with exact numbers, but the losses were substantial. The forsaken baggage train alone signified immense financial, equipment, and supply losses. Cavalry units had already suffered significant casualties in the previous engagement near the M, and the 2.5 days of continuous fighting on that causeway resulted in considerable attrition across all 4 legions. On the Germanic side, the unsuccessful assault on the camp exacted a heavy toll in terms of reputation as much as lives. Inguire, who had advocated for the assault against Arminius's warnings, sustained injuries himself. The warriors who joined him in that attack had been promised booty, riches, glory, and Roman eagle standards as trophies. Instead, they faced a Roman counterattack at dawn and a difficult retreat back into the forest. And regarding Arminius, I want to dwell on this for a moment. Arminius was not vanquished. His forces were not annihilated. He executed an orderly retreat and survived to fight again. He continued to do so for another 6 years, until his death in 21 AD, when he was killed, not by Rome, but by members of his own tribe in an internal political conflict. His alliance eventually dissipated. His fame, however, only grew, and Rome never again seriously attempted to subdue the territory east of the Rhine. This campaign casts a long shadow over all subsequent events. Now, I want to be straightforward with you about something, because this channel is not one to simply recount ancient sources without critical examination. Tacitus describes Pontes Longi as a Roman victory, and by a strict definition, Caecina successfully brought his army home. That is technically accurate. However, modern historian Peter Wells, in his exhaustive study of the Germanicus campaigns, characterizes the engagement as inconclusive, and I believe his assessment warrants serious consideration. Arminius never lost his army. The Romans abandoned their entire baggage train, signifying enormous practical and monetary losses. The Germanic forces so effectively disrupted the Roman withdrawal that Caecina reached the Rhine without provisions, without horses, and with severely depleted units across all 4 legions. If that constitutes a victory, it's the kind of victory that makes one carefully scrutinize the meaning of the word. There's also the larger campaign narrative to consider. Germanicus continued military operations in Germania throughout 16 AD. He achieved actual victories. The engagement at the Vizza River in 16 AD was a genuine Roman tactical triumph with significant Germanic casualties. He recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagle standards. By any reasonable strategic measure, the campaigns achieved something meaningful, and then Tiberius recalled him. In 17 AD, Germanicus was withdrawn from Germania and reassigned to the eastern provinces. Ancient accounts, particularly by Tacitus, suggest this was due to Tiberius's jealousy of his nephew's popularity with the legions, and that interpretation may well be true. By all accounts, Tiberius was not a generous or trusting individual. However, the recall also made sound strategic sense. The Germanicus campaigns were incredibly costly. 60 to 70,000 soldiers, 3 years of active campaigning in hostile territory, naval support, and the logistical nightmare of supplying such a large force across the Rhine. And despite all that investment, Rome still couldn't hold the territory. The forest simply kept reclaiming it. Rome did get its retribution. It recovered 2 eagles. It punished the Cherusci and their allies severely enough to fragment the coalition Arminius had forged. It demonstrated clearly and expensively that Rome had the capability to project military power deep into Germania when it chose to, but it could not remain. And Tiberius, who was pragmatic in a way that Germanicus perhaps was not, understood that the cost of prolonged occupation was a price Rome did not need to pay. The Rhine became the permanent frontier. It would remain Rome's de facto eastern boundary in the north for the next 4 centuries. The land east of that river, where Arminius and his warriors lived, fought, and resisted conquest, never became Roman. The language spoken there never became a derivative of Latin. The legal customs, social structures, and cultural foundations were never shaped by centuries of Roman rule, the way they were in Gaul, Britain, and Iberia. If you wish to comprehend the fundamental divergence between contemporary France and Germany, reflected in their distinct languages and profoundly varied cultural trajectories, a significant piece of the answer lies within a marshy region of Germania in 15 AD. There, on a precarious log pathway, 4 Roman legions narrowly avoided complete annihilation on a single perilous night. This is not exaggeration. This was the actual gravity of the situation. Rome possessed the most sophisticated military apparatus the ancient Western world had ever seen. In open combat, Roman legions were nearly invincible for their era. The unparalleled combination of training, equipment, logistics, engineering, and tactical doctrine, refined over centuries of incessant conflict, was truly exceptional. Whether facing Carthage in open battle, the Macedonians, the Gauls on level ground, or even Parthia under favorable circumstances, Roman legions consistently triumphed. So why did they falter in Germania? The primary reason is straightforward and fundamental: the topography. East of the Rhine, the North European plain, with its dense forests, numerous rivers, bogs, and marshes, effectively nullified every inherent advantage of the Roman military system. Roman tactical principles centered on the shield wall, the synchronized cohort advance, and concentrated force applied in disciplined, close-order formations against an enemy willing to engage in open terrain. All of this demands ample, flat, and stable ground. The Germanic forests offered Rome none of these conditions. A fully equipped legionary, bearing approximately 110 to 130 pounds including his own weight, is a weapon system optimized for specific environments. Immerse him in knee-deep swamp mud and thick forest undergrowth, and he becomes sluggish, encumbered, and predictable. Conversely, place a Germanic warrior beside him in the same environment, a man raised in those woods, familiar with every game trail and stream, armed with a light weapon and no armor, and the technological superiority of Rome completely vanishes. The secondary explanation is strategic. Arminius grasped a critical insight that Verus failed to comprehend, and which even Germanicus struggled to fully resolve. Securing territory and achieving victory are not synonymous in this form of warfare. You could prevail in every pitched battle you manage to instigate, yet still lose the entire campaign simply because your adversary would absorb the defeat, retreat into the forest, and await your withdrawal. Rome could raze villages, devastate agricultural land, and coerce tribes into temporary submission. However, the moment the legions retreated across the Rhine for winter, the power vacuum would be filled almost instantaneously. There was no established infrastructure to build upon, no significant Roman roads, no cities to garrison, and very few trustworthy local leaders to rely on. Segestes, Arminius's pro-Roman father-in-law, stands as the exception that proves this rule. The third contributing factor was Arminius himself. In a very real sense, he was the perfect adversary for Rome, precisely because Rome had shaped him. He understood the system from within, the formations, the camp layouts, the institutional preference for open battle, the psychological influence of the Eagle standards, and how Roman units communicated and reacted under duress. He leveraged all of this against them. Following Teutoburg, Rome adapted. The campaigns led by Germanicus demonstrate genuine tactical evolution, including improved reconnaissance, more flexible column structures, and reliance on naval supply routes to lessen overland dependency on vulnerable roads. The Romans were not inflexible. They learned. Nevertheless, the core problem, that this particular terrain was fundamentally unsuitable for their military system, regardless of adjustments, could not be circumvented. It had to be acknowledged, and eventually it was. Here is a postscript on Arminius that I believe warrants more consideration than it typically receives. By any reasonable historical assessment, the man triumphed. He halted the Roman conquest of Germania. He maintained a coalition of independent, proud, and often disparate tribes through years of brutal conflict against the most formidable military power on earth. He consistently outmaneuvered Roman generals. He possessed a truly remarkable understanding of his landscape, his people, and his enemies. Then, in 21 AD, 6 years after Pontes Longi, Arminius was assassinated by members of his own tribe, not in battle or by a Roman soldier. He was murdered during an internal power struggle among the Cherusci. Tacitus offers a brief and somewhat dispassionate account. Arminius had attempted to claim kingship over the Cherusci, and other chieftains had him killed for it. The man who refused to be ruled by Rome tried to become a king himself, and it proved to be his undoing. Tacitus, in one of the most compelling passages in ancient historical writing, refers to him as the liberator of Germania, a man who challenged Rome not in its nascent stages, but at the apex of its might. Continually suffered setbacks in battle, but he was never absolutely defeated in the prolonged conflict. This remark comes from a Roman historian discussing Rome's adversary, representing the closest thing to an honest acknowledgement Rome ever paid to one of its conquerors. The night Arminius failed to win that vote against Inguire, I sometimes ponder if a part of him already foresaw the future unfolding. Allow me to offer an insight worth contemplating long after this discussion concludes. The cultural footprint of the Roman Empire was vast and enduring. Wherever Rome seized and maintained governance for generations, Latin became the predominant language. Roman jurisprudence formed the bedrock of legal frameworks. Roman urban planning established cities that persist today. Roman Christianity disseminated along its roads. The contemporary Romance languages, including French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian, are all direct derivatives of Latin. Their existence is a testament to Rome's prolonged and profound presence, allowing its culture to deeply embed itself. To the west of the Rhine, Gaul evolved into France, with Roman infrastructure, law, and language forming its Latin-based foundations. Conversely, east of the Rhine, the Germanic clans that Rome never subjected eventually developed into the citizens of modern Germany. Their language never transitioned into a Romance language. It remained Germanic, developing autonomously and leading to the language spoken in Berlin presently. The legal and cultural traditions that emerged there never experienced the centuries of Roman influence that shaped nations like France and Spain. One river, serving as both an administrative and military boundary, delineated two entirely distinct civilizational paths on either side. This division was significantly defined by events at Pontes Longi, by what transpired at Teutoburg, and by Arminius successfully maintaining his alliance through years of challenging warfare. Ultimately, Rome concluded that the territory was not worth the cost. Monumental outcomes, such as the evolution of languages, national borders, and the basis of legal systems, stem from isolated incidents. Individual decisions are made by particular people under immense strain. A vote in a shadowy forest. A commander positioned in a gateway. I wish to revisit our starting point. Caecina Severus in the darkness, awakening from his nightmare. Arminius is reaching towards him from the marsh. The sound of Germanic chants echoes from the surrounding woods. 20,000 soldiers are trapped within those fortifications. Some are barely holding it together, while others are already at the gates before he could intercept them. He had faced difficult situations before. 4 decades of service present numerous such challenges. However, this particular predicament possessed a unique quality that, I believe, only someone who has studied past catastrophes can fully grasp. He was not merely confronting an adversary, he was battling the lingering memory of what that adversary had already accomplished. The specter of Teutoburg permeated the camp as tangibly as any Germanic combatant outside it. Caecina Severus was compelled to contend with both. When disarray erupted and men bolted for the gate, he had various options. He could have brandished his sword and menaced them. He could have issued commands, trusting his centurions to enforce them. He could have asserted himself as an authoritative figure demanding compliance. Instead, he prostrated himself in the mucky ground. He interposed his body between his troops and the encroaching darkness. He, in effect, declared, "You will have to proceed over me." This act halted their panic. Not a directive, not a menace. The spectacle of their general, elderly, decorated, and drenched in the day's blood and mud, lying prostrate, willing to be trampled rather than witness his army perish due to a mere rumor. That image resonates with me. Leadership at its most extreme often resembles less the issuance of commands and more the personal absorption of affliction, safeguarding those relying on you from having to endure it themselves. On the hill overlooking him, Arminius was enacting a different form of sacrifice. Accepting a ruling he recognized as flawed, committing his warriors to an attack his own strategic wisdom indicated would fail. This was because the alternative meant shattering the alliance he had meticulously forged over years. To abandon his chieftains and watch everything he had constructed dissolve. He chose the coalition over his own superior judgment. The coalition ultimately failed him. 2 individuals facing 2 insurmountable knights, 2 distinct leadership approaches under immense pressure, and between them, the outcome of a military campaign that would shape a continent for centuries. History is not predestined. It is not the automatic manifestation of economic forces or geographical fate, though these factors hold significance. It is also this: a man lying in a gateway, a man losing a vote, a general's nightmare, an uncle's pride, the decision to jettison supplies versus the choice to save lives. The divergence between Rome and Germania, in a discernible and meaningful sense, hinged on specific individuals making precise choices during particular harrowing moments. That is why I consistently revisit these narratives. They possess significance beyond mere tactics, formations, and maps, because in each unfolding event, you can discern something familiar. You witness firsthand the reality of complex individuals, fearful, proud, brilliant, and unyielding, making choices whose repercussions the rest of us ultimately inherit. This is the essence of history's purpose. If you've remained until now, you already understand whether this channel resonates with you. Should it, please consider giving this video a thumbs up. While it might seem trivial, it substantially influences whether these videos reach individuals actively seeking such content. And if you haven't yet subscribed, rectify that oversight immediately. We consistently deliver in-depth explorations of pivotal moments that truly shape the world, presenting them in the manner they merit. The next video is on its way, and you'll want to be present for it. Just one more thought before I conclude. Tacitus characterized Arminius as Germania's liberator. He was a man who challenged Rome not in its nascent stages, but at the zenith of its might, and despite frequent defeats, he was never truly vanquished in the conflict. Never truly vanquished. Even his adversaries conceded that they never fully overcame him. Hold on, actually, before you navigate away. I wish to impart one additional element because a facet of this narrative remains unaddressed, and it has lingered with me throughout our discussion. We've dedicated considerable time to discussing Caecina and Arminius. Both were commanders, two exceptionally brilliant, battle-hardened individuals operating at the very limits of human endurance under duress. However, a third individual in this account seldom receives attention, and I believe that's an oversight. His name is Inguiamus. I acknowledge portraying him as the one who misjudged, the uncle who disregarded his nephew's master strategy and sent warriors to their demise against a Roman encampment at dawn. And that description holds true to a certain extent. Strategically, Arminius was correct and Inguiamus erred. End of discussion. Yet I want to challenge that straightforward interpretation for a moment, because Inguiamus was far from foolish. He operated entirely within the logical framework of his own reality. Consider the trajectory of his life until that point. He was a senior Cheruscan chieftain who had maintained a functional relationship with Rome for years. He had navigated the incredibly intricate political landscape of residing on the Roman frontier, making appropriate gestures, ensuring his people's sustenance and safety, and avoiding the kind of conflicts that annihilated tribes. He had observed Rome for decades. He possessed a deeper comprehension of Roman power than almost any Germanic warrior alive. And then he switched allegiances. He assessed Arminius's accomplishments, determined the opportune moment had arrived, and committed. That decision demanded genuine bravery. Inguiamus was not some impetuous young warrior intoxicated by fantasies of glory. He was a seasoned statesman who made a calculated gamble. His error at Pontes Longi was not born of foolishness, it was overconfidence stemming from valid experience. He had witnessed Roman armies in distress before. He had seen the consequences when Roman discipline faltered. And standing outside that camp in the darkness, apprehending the panic within the defenses, hearing the whispers that the soldiers had nearly fractured and fled, he believed he was observing a shattered army. His assessment of the symptoms was accurate. His diagnosis, however, was flawed. A Roman army that panics at night and is subsequently re-established by its general sacrificing himself at the gate is not broken. It is a highly stressed army commanded by an exceptional general. There's a crucial distinction, and that difference only becomes evident in the morning when the gates open and the sortie emerges. By then, it was too late. I often reflect on Inguiamus in the context of contemporary leadership failures because his error is one we recognize. He focused on superficial indicators, the panic, the rumors, the discarded provisions, the fatigued soldiers. And he deduced that the foundational system had collapsed. He failed to account for the impact a single individual, strategically positioned and making the correct decision at the precise moment, could have in stabilizing that system. That is a challenging factor to incorporate into any assessment because leadership at that level defies predictability. It cannot be modeled. Caecina's act of lying in that gate was not systemic behavior. It was the action of a specific human being endowed with 40 years of experience and a particular obstinacy that no military doctrine can produce on demand. Inguiamus planned against the army he could perceive. He should have planned against the general he could not. There is one final aspect I wish to explore before we conclude: Germanicus himself. We have primarily considered him as a strategic mastermind, the individual who devised campaigns, divided forces, and ordered withdrawals. Yet, Germanicus also grappled with a phenomenon insufficiently discussed in military history: the political dynamics of commanding men who meticulously scrutinize you for any indication of weakness. When Caecina's forces almost collapsed at Pontes Longi, Germanicus was absent, having already embarked on his journey home. Upon receiving news of the near catastrophe, ancient records suggest a severe reaction erupted in Rome. Tacitus recounts the widespread assumption in the capital that the army had been annihilated and Caecina killed, leading to immediate panic until confirmation arrived that the legions had safely returned. For Germanicus, this close call presented a challenge extending beyond military concerns. He had presented these campaigns to Tiberius as acts of vengeance, aimed at restoring Roman prestige. The plan was for Rome to launch decisive strikes, reclaim the lost eagles, assert dominance, and then withdraw. What transpired, however, was considerably more chaotic. What were intended as punitive expeditions devolved into relentless attritional conflicts against an unyielding foe. While genuine victories were achieved, they remained incomplete, and the return journey nearly resulted in a second disaster, which would have politically ended Germanicus's career and potentially the entire campaign. Tiberius observed these events with a calculating mind, characteristic of those who survived the intricate power dynamics of Roman imperial politics. I believe, open to debate, that Pontes Longi significantly influenced his conclusion that the Germania project had inherent limits, a point beyond which the costs of Roman efforts east of the Rhine would permanently outweigh the benefits. Germanicus returned in 16 AD, securing significant triumphs such as the Battle of the Weser and the assault on the Angevarian Wall. He effectively pushed back Germanic forces and recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagle standards throughout the campaigns. By most tactical measures, he was succeeding. Yet Tiberius recalled him nonetheless. Tacitus, strongly sympathetic to Germanicus, recorded the official rationale as jealousy. Tiberius supposedly couldn't bear his nephew's accumulating glory. This might hold some truth, as Tiberius was certainly prone to such pettiness. However, I believe the more pragmatic, if less dramatic, explanation is that Tiberius reviewed the 3 years of Germania campaigns, tallying the human cost, financial expenditures, and near disasters, and concluded that Rome was pursuing a strategy without a viable end goal. While the Germanic tribes could be hurt, they could not be permanently subjugated. The dense forests always proved their ultimate defense. Each year the army remained east of the Rhine, increased the risk of another event like Pontes Longi, another night where 20,000 men face chaos, another commander making an impossible decision with no room for error. It seemed more sensible to solidify the border, making the Rhine the definitive line, fortifying it, and allocating resources to frontiers where lasting occupation was actually feasible. Whether this was the correct decision has been debated by historians for 2 millennia. Tacitus believed Germanicus could have finished the war had he been given more time. Modern scholars are more skeptical, citing the substantial and likely insurmountable geographical and logistical challenges of permanently occupying Germania with the resources available to Rome. My perspective is that Tiberius saw Pontes Longi as a pivotal warning and acted upon it. Regardless of whether one agrees with his conclusion, he was addressing the critical issues. The campaigns ceased. The Rhine became the border, and the very fabric of our modern world, its languages, legal frameworks, and the cultural divisions that endure across Europe, was partly shaped by that consequential decision. One general, one crucial passage, one night in a Germanic marsh. I will meet you in the next engagement.